So if anybody has any questions, you can always reach me at that. It's a very complicated Gmail. Oh, you're going to introduce yourself.
Yeah. And I'm Jonathan Kinkley. I'm the director of Chicago Gamespace. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm also the co-curator of the Light Cycle's 40th anniversary of TRON in Film and Games exhibition that's up currently through August 27th. It'll also be open after the talk if anyone wants to stick around and play some TRON games and see some artifacts from the film. Gamespace doesn't often have public programs unless there's a really, really special occasion. And we have that today. We're all in for a treat. An important pioneer of computer animation, Bill Kroyer, we're grateful to have you join us today, Bill. And when you close your eyes and you think of the movie TRON, the image that comes to mind is, of course, the light cycles. That's why we named our show that's why Disney crafted the ride based around that premise. And it's that masterful piece of film and animation that brings us here today. And we're grateful to you, Bill, for sharing some stories about that segment. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bill Kroyer.
Who's hitting, are you hitting the button? Are you hitting the button? Okay. So, yeah, I went on the Chicago events thing and I saw the light cycle thing and I thought, hey, light cycle's in Chicago. I should go down there. So, I'll just talk a little bit about how we did that. So, animating TRON, there I am. That's how I looked in those days. That's me in my TRON. We had those little hats, you know, they were done. If you've ever seen these in real life, they're pretty crazy. They were like basically, you know, helmets, and then Richard Taylor striped them with like black tape, literally with an X-Acto blade and tape. That's how he did this at circuitry. So I'll just do this every time I use it. So that was Disney in 1977. That building still looks the same. That's, I don't know if you've ever visited the lot in Burbank, but that's the animation building that he built after Snow White. And all the animators lived in that building, and when I started training at Disney in 1977. That's Mickey Mouse and Dopey Drive corner right there. And there you have it. Next. So anyway, this was an animator in 1927. You know, you sat at a desk with a drawing disc and you had a paper on punches and you drew on it, right? And you had a pencil. That was how you did animation in 1927, actually before that. And then this is 50 years later, in 1977, when I arrived at Disney. It's exactly the same. The technology had not changed at all. Animators sitting at desks with punched paper on light tables. That's Eric Larson, one of the 9 old men. And if you get the next one, I was in the training room. That's me in the white shirt with my back to you. And sitting there with Eric Larson, the guy with the long hair on the right is Henry Selick, who directed Coraline and Night Before Christmas. So we were so lucky to be in this animation training program with, and Willie Rutherman, one of the 9 old men, was there, Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnson. So it was an unusually wonderful thing because we were basically experiencing animation as it had always been done. You know, we walked in just at the tail end before anything changed. So
Can I ask how you were selected for the training program?
Sorry?
Can I ask how you were selected for the training program?
It was, you know, here's the thing, is that think how the number of people who can animate is a tiny number of people in the human race who can animate with a pencil. And so I didn't have a lot of competition to get in a training program. You know, they had not accepted anybody for 50 years. And all of a sudden they realized they were running out of people, and so they had a review board. And you're supposed to go in with a portfolio. I never had art school, but I had worked in a commercial studio. I'll abbreviate this. So I had my reel of commercials and I submitted that, and they said, this guy can at least animate, so that's how I got into the training program. So anyway, the only technology, that's it. So when I was sitting at my desk in 1977 animating, if a Snow White animator from 1930 had walked in, he could sit down and do my job with 0 training. Everything, all the exposure sheets, the scene folders, the scene stacker, everything was unchanged. The only thing different was he wouldn't have to crank a pencil sharpener, although the crank pencil sharpeners were still on the desks. But we all bought our own electric pencil sharpeners. So anyway, again, I did the training program for several years, and then Lisberger came to town. Steve Lisberger, he was an animator from Boston. He sold NBC this special called Animal Olympics, and so he came to Disney. I can't believe they let him in. And he went around to the animation department, and he basically pitched us all on quitting Disney to work for him, you know. And at the time, Disney was going to do The Black Cauldron, which I thought was a terrible movie. I could tell already, and I just thought, this doesn't look fun. Whereas this guy, Steve Lisberger, he seems like a fun guy. So I was the only one. I left Disney, and I went, and because I was the only Disney guy, he made me the animation director of this movie. So I go on Animal Olympics. So I did that for a year and a half, and then as we were wrapping this up, Steve had this new idea, Tron. Because video games were big, we were all going to the arcades and playing games, and Steve had this idea. So this is an interesting thing. The very first tests we did on Tron looked like that. Because he had this idea of a person in an electronic world, right? But at the time, nobody knew anything about computer animation. We all knew about drawing characters. So the idea was, why don't we just draw the characters and we'll clean them up with clean lines, and then instead of painting them like you normally would do, we'll just photograph those clean lines and we'll make negatives of those, which will mean they'll be black with clear, and then we'll put lights behind that on the animation stand, and we'll have electronic looking guys. And so the very first character tests on Tron looked like that. Next. And then we had this idea, and then for some reason, Steve started humming around, where can I sell this movie? And weirdly enough, Disney was the one studio that bid. And the reason they bid, I don't know if you guys know about film history, but the Disney movies were pretty bad in 1978, 1979. And they hired this young guy named Tom Wilhite to come in and revitalize the company. And he was looking for something new, and here comes Steve Lisberger, I'm going to do a movie about computers. And he went, that sounds revolutionary. So weirdly enough, they hire Steve, and of course he says, well, and bring me back a few people, and one of them was my animation director, Bill Kroyer, and I just left 2 years earlier as a beginning animator. And they said, well, he can't be a director, he's got to wait 8 more years. And Steve said, sorry guys, he's my guy. So that's how I leapfrogged the pay scale in the union. I got it. I did better. Anyway, so we get back to Disney. So what do we do? Well, first thing we do
with the Tron character.
Sorry?
With the Tron character, didn't you guys also sell a version of that character for a commercial?
You know, I'm trying to think if we did something before Tron. I don't think so. I
thought it was a radio.
While we were in the warehouse in Andalusia, we almost got the script finished, and I was storyboarding sample sequences, and we had a couple of development artists doing stuff. But Steve sold it based on a couple of those tests and the basic idea. So we all moved back to Burbank, back to the animation building, and I found myself back in the same building where I was training 2 years before. And then, of course, like any movie, you storyboard, right? So you know, so filmmaking, but in the animation world, that's Walt Disney showing storyboards back in 1929. Everybody storyboards, and storyboards are hand drawn, right? And then you put them up on boards like that, and you pitch the sequence, and that's how every movie was made. And you know, live action movies often did not do that. You know, like you would just go out and shoot the movie. But all animated movies did that because there's nothing to shoot, right? I mean, an animated movie, you don't make 10 scenes and decide which one. You only make one scene. So you better know before you make the scene that it fits into the other 1,200 scenes, which is why animation is storyboarded. Next. So anyway, being animators turned out to be the essential ingredient for making this movie, Tron, because this is the kind of stuff we were getting in 1980. When the word went out to the world, Disney is making an animated film. All you computer animation companies, send us your reels, let's see what you got. That's the kind of stuff we got. That's from New York Institute of Technology right there. But, I'm not kidding, that literally was the level. It was that, and it was logos. You know, if you look at 1979, you're gonna see NBC logos and that kind of stuff. That was it, that was computer animation. That's all there was. So, you know, we started the movie with traditional visual development. And we were talking earlier about this, you know. We didn't put any limitations on the designers. We didn't say, don't worry about how limited the technology is, don't worry about how we're going to make it. just design a movie that looks right. You know, design a movie that's a story that fits the story. So, you know, these are, you know, that's like Peter Lloyd. He was the master of airbrush paintings. He started doing those. Some of his first paintings done on the movie. That was actually done back at Lisberger Studios. Did you zoom in?
No, this is the next slide.
Oh, okay. Anyway, you can see some little thumbnail shots. That was an early MCP thing there with the column. That was the original Solar Sailor idea, going over the sea of simulation right there. They would go to the next one. And then, of course, Steve knew Sid Mead. He knew that this guy was one of the... Sid Mead was a guy, and he was described as a new name. He was called a futurist, because he was doing these amazing paintings of futuristic worlds and vehicles. So Steve heard about that, so he thought, well, this is the guy, right? So he got Sid Mead in, and Sid started designing objects for the movie. And the first thing he did was the light cycle, because it was one of the first sequences we were going to do. Next.
Bill, is it okay if we take pictures or do you
Yeah, you can take, there's nothing in here that's, yeah, everything,
Okay.
it's cool. So anyway, these are some Sid's for earlier pictures. You can see Sid signed every single drawing he did. Next. And with Sid's designs and the script and kickoff drawings by Mobius, we started with the board. How many people have ever heard of Mobius, Jean Giraud? So this guy was a fluke of nature in the most wonderful sense. You know, he was a genius. Like I've known thousands of artists in my life. I've only known one or two that were like Sid Mead. He could literally take a piece of paper and start in the upper left, right, and just start to draw and finish in the lower right, and it's this gorgeous picture with perspective, and everything's perfect. And he could draw anything. He was just an amazing artist. So he wanders into our storyboard room. It's just me and Jerry Reeves. We're storyboarding the whole movie, and Mobius comes in and says, "I'm going to help you for a little while." What? And so Jean Giraud comes in, and we start the storyboard. And this is the kind of detail of the storyboards. They're quite simple, you know, as you can see. And one thing you're going to notice right away, hold on right there, is just a little bit of shading. You see how just a little bit of shading on the bike, and a little bit of shading on the thing. Believe it or not, that was kind of an important step, because very often in animation storyboarding, if you go online and you look up story, it would just be drawings, right? But when Mobius started to board with us, he immediately said to us, you know, I really think that you need to add dimensionality to the drawings, because this movie is going to be made in a dimensional world. The computer is a dimensional world, and you're going to be showing these to people who have never worked in film and don't understand what they're looking at. So the more you can help them along by adding dimensionality to your drawings, the easier it will be for them to understand what you're presenting. And so with just a few cool gray and warm gray markers, we started adding just that little bit to the storyboards, and it just helped make them look more understandable. The red arrow is pointing to the number of the shot. It's like 39.3, and then if you go to the next slide, it says 18x. That means 18 frames. Because what we did was we would storyboard on these pieces of paper, right? And then we just write a little number on the bottom, and we'd send the stack off to animation camera at night, and they would shoot all those, and that would make a story reel. You know, story reel is a standard process in animation. And then we would have a reel to cut into the rest of the movie. So, you know, as the live action started to be shot, you would go to the editorial room and you would watch the reels, and anything that was animated would be in story reel, because it was going to take months to actually do any animation. So anyway, that's how it started. So here's the light cycle. So you can just flip through these, keep going. And you can see, keep going, you can see now how closely the finished film kind of followed our drawings. You know, being 2D animators, when you're animating in 2D, you have to really know what you're going to do first, because the page is blank. So you have to visualize and draw everything exactly as you intend to see it. And that really was an essential skill doing Tron, because there was no way to preview anything. Remember, there was no animation software. There was no preview software. So what we were drawing was going to end up being the final guide for the final looking film. And so you can see it was not just, and it wasn't like the computer guys looking at that image. It was us actually, it was helping us imagine exactly how big would it be, how fast would it move. As I'll show you, we ended up doing all these graphs to define the animation. So anyway, at the end of this, click a couple more, you're going to see a side, okay, there we go. So this is a side-by-side reel that shows you how accurate the drawings we did were to the final light cycle chase.
At the time you're drawing those boards, did you have any idea that you're going to actually be able to achieve something that matched that close? I mean,
well, you know, we'd been working with Magi Syndivision, and they were the company that was going to make the three-dimensional models. Again, modeling in the computer in this day and age was not only like very primitive, but you have to realize that every computer company had their own software and their own hardware. There was no standard thing. There was no Maya, right? There was no Houdini. It was all, every company had a totally different, incompatible system. So you had to look at what every company had, and you could say, they can do this or they can do this. So the company that did the light cycles had a system that used solid geometry, because the founder of that company, Phil Middleman, had been a doctor who had invented the MRI machine. And the MRI machine works on the principle of rays bouncing off bone, right? So he thought, why don't I have the same mathematics of the rays bouncing off objects and making light?
Because it takes a lot of CPU time, that's why not.
Yeah. So anyway, they invented this, they get these guys, they wrote the software, but the only models you could build were models you could make out of mathematical primitive shapes. So you had a circle, a square, a triangle, a pyramid, you know, a rectangle. You know, you only had about 10 basic shapes, and by adding and subtracting shapes, you could make models. And that's how they made the tank and the recognizer and the light cycles. They made them by adding and subtracting geometric shapes, and that was magic. So we knew we had that, and then as far as motion, it had to move somehow, so we knew it was going to move.
what about camera? Because ultimately, probably no one's really invested in camera work at that time.
There was no camera.
That's what, I guess that's what I mean.
There's no
like,
camera. There was the camera's your imagination, right? So anyway, we
one
visualized. Yes.
Did Sid Mead understand Magi's
Nothing.
limitations?
No, nothing at all. It was never.
He just drew something cool.
Sid and Mobius were never burdened with any limitations from the technology. They simply said, "Give us drawings, and we'll just see how close we can come."
So it was just fortuitous that they used like a sphere for the front and kind of primitive models.
Yeah. Well, if you really look at the real Sid Mead designs, we couldn't really get all the way there. If you really compare it side by side, you're going to see that the Sid Mead design was a little fancier, and all we could really get was the one we ended up with, which is a little simpler, you know. The Solar Sailor, which was an organic design, see, that was done by another company called III, and they actually had developed polygonal modeling, which of course is the way most complex models went after this. And polygonal modeling simply means you sit there, you set vectors, and you connect them with polygons, and you can have organic shapes. So that became, the more complex and organic models were done by III. So continuing on, when we visualized this, okay, so now we knew what we wanted to make, right? We'd gotten it approved. How do you describe motion to a computer in an age when there's no animation software? So that's the Magi Syndivision bike. You can kind of imagine it being additions and subtractions of. So the first thing we had to do is, how do we describe the motion of the bike? And we just went ahead, next slide, and we created this kind of simple guide. And we said, you know, we had to define yaw, pitch, and roll, because there are three angles, right? Where yaw, pitch, and roll, right? Those are the three basic angles that you move something. So we would define yaw, pitch, and roll, and it was very simple. If the bike, you can see the vertical tilt, you know, negative and positive. So we had 0 as being if the bike was tilted all the way over to the left. And if it was 90, the bike would be upright. If it was 180, the bike would be tilted all the way to the right. It's not difficult to understand. Same thing with the yaw, same thing with the pitch. So now we have 3 numbers to describe angles. Now we had to describe positioning, and that's a Cartesian world, which means it's an XYZ world, right? So basically it's XYZ. Where's the bike at XYZ? And to help us do that, we started to draw our graphs. And these were all hand-drawn graphs. This is a light cycle traveling through, this is a top view of a light cycle traveling through a canyon, right? So we would graph out we'd design the dimensions of the canyon. We'd pretend it in feet, we just picked a number. And then we started using the graph paper, we started saying where it would be on frame 1, where it would be on frame 20, et cetera, et cetera. And we started to do this. Next. And you can see this was an example of how a bike turns, We actually had the number of feet, 18.33 feet from the beginning of the turn to the middle of the turn, and the turn ends, and, pretty basic, But remember, we can't see any of this. We're just hoping that when somebody types all these numbers in, it's going to look okay. So go next.
Bill, can I ask?
Yes.
This must have been a huge departure from what you've been doing if you've been hand drawing character animation. Did this feel really foreign at the time? Did it be like doing graphs and,
man, it was
18.3?
It was absolutely terrible and awful, and there are very few animators in the world would have or could have done it.
That's a big
Because
difference.
it's like, imagine, I can't even, running in cement shoes, I mean,
Just checking.
you have to have this, you have to go through all of this work to get something you could have done on paper in 2 minutes. So anyway, again, this was a camera move. You had to animate the camera too, right? You had to have the position on every single frame of where the camera was, what it was looking at. So that was a graph of the camera. Next. This was a rather complicated thing of 3 bikes. I don't know if you remember the scene in the movie with the 3 bikes. They come out of the canyon and they skid to a halt right on the cliff edge. That's the graph of that. There you see the rate of deceleration of the bikes. Okay, go ahead. And this was this is a camera move. The camera starts right behind the bike, and then it rises up and looks back as the bike goes. So that's the highly sophisticated way we did it, was drawing graphs and writing, so that the guys would understand it. Next.
But you can, moving the camera to look down on a 3-dimensional thing, that's pretty hard in hand-drawing animation, right? Is this a thing that's
and there you have the revolutionary part of this way. No one had ever seen it, because you really don't move the camera in 2D, right? It's very laborious to draw the world changing. But that was the revolutionary thing about Tron, is nobody had ever gone into the world, because now we're going into a dimensional world. And that's why moving the camera was so important to us. It was providing moves that basically no one had ever seen in animation before, right?
And you're still plotting out physically how many feet the camera would be moving up.
Sure. Right. So, there's no such thing as motion software. We had to render each bike on every frame. So for 1 second of movement, 24 frames, we had to say, frame number 1, you have these numbers. Frame number 2, you have these numbers. Frame number 3, you have these numbers. So think about this. We had an X sheet. Those of you who know animation know a little bit about exposure sheets. This was in traditional animation since 1915. You would write down your drawings and how they were exposed and how many frames they were exposed, if you had a held cell, etc. So basically, this is an X sheet for one of the scenes. Notice on the left side, there were 6 channels, X, Y, Z, pitch, roll. You had to have one for every frame of every object and every camera. Next. So anyway, 144 values per second. So trying at 15 minutes of computer-generated animation, 900 seconds of footage, with an average of 2 vehicles and a moving camera in each shot. That was 322,000 values we were going to have to hand figure out. And believe me, after like the first week, we was doing, this is freaking nuts. So, I had a brilliant idea. And I take full credit for this. And I always have, without fear of contradiction. There's one computer on the lot, and it was on the Oxbury. And if you look to the right, there it was, a guy named, now if you ever work with an animation camera, see those dials below the table? They're little cranks, and that's what makes the table go left and right when you're doing pan moves and everything with animation artwork. They were driven by, so what this guy, Bill Tondor, figured out was he replaced the hand crank with servo motors, right? So they'd be electronically driven. But he attached them to a computer, and he could type in beginning and end values, and the computer would do a basic B-spline, can ease in, ease out. So if you wanted to go from, have a pan move from here to here, you would just type in, okay, my camera's starting at 3 west, 4 south, and it's gonna end at 6 east, 2 north, and you type that in, and you'd hit a button, and the computer would generate all the values on a B-spline between those 2 frame ranges. And I suddenly realized that's what we need. Instead of having to calculate and animate, 96 individual numbers for 4 seconds, all I have to do is give the computer this one and this one, and if I have some unusual moves in the middle, I'll put a couple of the keys, and it'll do a spline through all of them, and I'll have all my numbers. And that's what we did. Now, the bad news was there wasn't any printer connected to this damn thing. So we ended up, if you can believe this, we ended up taking Polaroids of the screen and sending them to the computer company and making them type them in. So anyway, that's how we did.
But was the idea that you would take those values and then enter them into the computer to adjust the image?
Well, that defined the location of the objects in every single frame, which is how you define the
Right.
motion and the speed. That's how he did. That's what made the illusion of motion. You notice Tron has no motion blur in it. You probably all know what motion blur is. There was no motion blur invented at that time, so that wasn't an issue. You just placed things here and here and here and here, right? That's how you did it.
So did someone have to type in the values for every frame?
Yes, they did. They had an entire crew of people doing that. So this is how we looked at the computers at the different companies would send their rendered images to, in this case, it's like a television set. It was like a cathode ray tube. He's adjusting it, and then there's a 35 millimeter camera pointing down at it. Or in this case, a 70 millimeter camera. And then each image would be basically painted on the CRT, and then they'd take one photo, animation stuff, send it to the lab. So the very, very first time we would ever see motion animated was in 70 millimeter. That's the first time. It would take us weeks and weeks and weeks, and we'd go to the soundstage, and they had a 70 millimeter screen that was as big as this wall. And we'd stand there and we'd watch the light cycles, and it blew us away, it blew everybody away. I mean, if you can't imagine in 1981 somebody standing in the screen and seeing a 70 millimeter image of those bikes coming right at you. Nobody had ever seen anything like that.
Why did they shoot in 70?
Because we were finishing the movie in 70.
Oh, it was?
Yeah, the movie was all shot in 70 millimeter. So we had to generate all our final imagery in 70 millimeters. So remember, it's so primitive, there's no translating between, if you're going to finish in 70, you got to shoot your test in 70, right?
Do you know why they chose 70 instead of 35?
To have a grand epic film.
Okay.
They shot the live action with the camera they used for Lawrence of Arabia. Same camera. Okay. So anyway, has everybody seen the light cycle sequence? Or do you want to watch it?
Yeah, we want to begin.
You want to watch it?
Sorry, you guys didn't see it. Right.
So when we first saw this, it seemed very flat because all of the grid lines were the same luminance. It didn't feel like it had depth. So again, somebody invented a very simple thing called depth cueing. And it simply meant the further away a line was from the camera origin, the dimmer it got. So that's why it appears, when you watch it, they appear to go, see how they go in the distance, it goes darker. And that was a great thing. We thought that was a great thing to come up with. So, does anybody ever notice, you guys notice the color discrepancy in that sequence? You notice how the bad guys are all driving blue bikes, even though Tron and Ram, they're all in blue light, they're in blue suits, whereas the bad guys are all wearing red suits, but they're driving blue bikes. The reason is, this was the very first computer sequence we did in the movie, and they had not yet decided on the color of the character striping. And they intellectually thought that warm colors would be good guys. So they thought Tron and all those guys would be, and Flynn would all be wearing yellows and reds and everything, and the bad guys would all be blue. But when they started to look at the tests of the live action shoot, they went, ugh, the blue looks really great, but the red and yellow, eh. So let's switch. So they switched. So all of a sudden now Tron and Flynn, they're all wearing blue. Well, we were halfway through the light cycle sequence. And you got to realize that this is such a difficult movie. We couldn't do redos. We didn't have any money or time to do retakes. So when it came time to composite the actors into the bikes, we had to put blue guys into red bikes and red guys into blue bikes. Nobody's ever seemed to really be bothered by that. So, anyway, this is a kind of a bogus picture. This was the only computer I ever personally operated on the movie. This came into the Disney studio about 6 months before we finished. It was called the Chromatics 9000. No, go back. And it just made little vector images. You could see them in squares. You couldn't see animation. But there was a phone cradle on the top, and we would, now instead of just having to wait until the 70mm version, we could at least get little thumbnail frames sent to us by the computer company. We could check them. That's what that was.
But this is not a raster display, it's a vector display.
It's a vector display, yeah. Just a vector display. So what would eventually look like that, we would preview and say, okay, that's close enough. You can see how crappy it was, And another thing that's kind of funny, there's me and Jerry Reese faking like we're really working. And that's the cradle on top. The other hokey thing about this, how we would save these images? You couldn't save them. We had a Polaroid camera with a kind of a hood, and we would just stick it against the thing and stick a Polaroid, and then stick the Polaroid up on the wall by our desks. That's how we kept track of everything. Okay.
Screenshots, right?
So anyway, there's some storyboards of the Solar Sailor, and again, this was a Mobius design, because it's much more organic, and this was the one done by Information Technologies, and Tron was a movie where we constantly were discovering what a computer could do and what they couldn't do. And one thing we discovered was the clipping plane. If you go to the next shot, you'll see we used the clipping plane as a device for the Solar Sailor forming. And the clipping plane is simply an imaginary plane that runs across and reveals what's behind it. So, the clipping plane is going forward and back and colorizing the thing. You guys remember the bit, right? That thing that, one of the first things we found out was that when things, they don't bump into each other in the computer. There's no, if it goes like this, they go right through each other. So that's why when we did have collisions, we had to be super, super precise on how we animated it. But then we got this idea, well, wait a minute, if you can have things do this, why don't we let's make a character out of that. And that's how we created the bit. Okay. So now I'm going to move off the animation for just a little bit and show you the bizarre, never to be done again system of how the rest of the movie was made, which is even more insane than the animation. So these were original concept drawings. And one thing great about Tron, of course, is that nothing looks like Tron to this day, and it never will, because it was done in such a bizarre way. Keep going. But it has a beauty to it, I think, because it's natural light. So that was this sequence was, you remember going into this is the passage into the world through the beam. And this was actually done by a third company, Robert Abel and Associates. Those are all vectors. So what Robert Abel did was they had an ENS machine, that is a Southern machine that would animate vectors. So they would divide this scene up into all these different colors, and then they would simply put a gel in front of the camera and run the vectors, and then rewind the film and run the next set of vectors and put another gel, and it was super primitive, but that's how they did it. Okay. So that's the entry into the other world. So this is a Sid Mead design of the tank, and next. It looked pretty great. Next. And this is how it's done. Now, if you go into the Gamespace office, if you've been in there, they have one of these codoliths up on the wall. It's actually trimmed. You can see it's 11 by 17 print. And the way the movie was done is, you know, the whole movie was shot on black sound stages with the characters in white and black outfits. Go next. So again, these are original sketches. Those are Mobius ideas. They're really cool ideas of vector people, and you know, that's how it's finally. They ended up wearing these tights. If there were any sets, the sets were all black and white. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that the way this is going to be colorized is you're going. Well, I'll get to that. There's the actors on the first day. So there's Flynn inside the prison set. You know, see, everything's just black and white. Go next. There's our actors. So anyway, you'd start with this. Okay, now you can slow down. Go to the next one. So now you take a frame. You shot a frame of Flynn, and he's a guy, and he's standing on the soundstage in black. Now, the thing about this is that everything in the shot had to be in focus. So I don't know if you know what deep focus is, but you know, usually when you're shooting light action photography, you focus on one thing, and everything else around it is out of focus. On Tron, everything had to be in focus, no matter how far away it was. To do that, you have to have an incredible amount of light on the stage. So Tron is the only movie that's ever blown the Burbank power grid. 3 times they knocked Burbank out because of all the frickin' light they were using on this film. But, oh, go back. So anyway, you start with that, right? So that's the shot that has been shot on the stage. Now you take that and you make codoliths out of that, which means you're going to print positive and negative film of that image. So the next one, if you see it, that's a negative version of it, right? You can see the animation peg holes on the bottom because all this stuff has to be reshot on an animation stand, self-run. Okay, the next shot is the background. So the background is shot first, but if you go to the next shot, you have a holdout mat of the characters. So the next thing you see, so this is the first thing that goes on your camera. You're shooting the background, usually backlit, and you're putting a mat that is protecting the emulsion of the film by having a black silhouette. So when you get this done, so everything around him is now done, but the black area is untouched film emulsion. Now you can continue to film on that area. So the next shot...
Is the background a hand painting?
Well, in that case it was, yeah. Almost all the backgrounds in Tron are hand painted, by the way. Very few, I'm not sure there was any CG painting, any CG environments.
Why was that?
It was very different. It was, again, primitive day. Well, actually, like the, you know, the what do you call it? All the, I take it back. All the canyons with the light cycles and the tanks. Those are all CG environments.
Okay.
But look how plain they are. They're just cubes, right? Matter of fact, when they did the 20th anniversary DVD release of Tron, a couple of guys in Maya, they did everything in 4 days. That took us 2 years. They literally reproduced everything in 4 days.
Wow.
And so anyway, now to protect the background, go to the next one. You do a slot mat, which is that, and you put those together, and now you've got the reverse. Now you're protecting the background painting, and now you're going to start exposing what's inside. So there's a shot that's going to light up the blue, in this case, the blue lines, right? So you shoot that level, then you have another level for the face, then you have another level for the hands. So for every single color you see on the screen in Tron, for every single color on any shot, that was a separate pass under camera with a combination of holdout and reveal mats. And to know what color you were shooting and what diffusion or whatever they were being shot at, you had to do these color tests and these what we call wedges. And for every single color and every single scene, you had to take the different gels and define the exposures of each gel. You know, you start with F7, you go to F14, you go all the way through. And these scene coordinators would sit there with little loops and they'd look at these strips and they'd say, okay, this one level I'm going to do an F14 with a diffusion filter of 3.
What's making these look diffuse?
That's what's called a diffusion filter. You have that on the lens of the camera.
Okay.
You know, so the camera
it's scattering light,
scattering light,
so you don't see a precise.
So go ahead. So anyway,
Bill, can I ask, is there a reason, so the whole thing was shot on an Oxberry, is there a reason why they didn't use an optical printer?
Yeah,
So
you
they
you can't stack 32 layers of, it's all
I
like
guess,
optical.
I guess I thought if you were masking everything, then you could just do it in different passes.
Yeah, but no, but that's what I'm saying. An optical printer, you have to provide film to the optical printer. What's on the film?
All right.
What would you have in the film, right? That's the entire
guess each
movie.
layer, I
This
don't know.
entire movie was self-locked. Every single frame of Tron. And that's why Disney was the only studio in the face of the earth that ever would have done this. Because Disney was an animation studio. They would use 200,000 acetate cells in a movie. If you were to say to Fox, we need another 75,000 codalith cells, they go, 75,000 codaliths! You know, Disney goes, okay, and they just write the check for 75,000 codaliths. So, okay, now, so this is a sequence of, see, this is all our CG, simple walls, simple environments. There's our Magi tank. But when you cut inside, now you're looking at the live action bit, right, which is totally different, obviously. But again, every color you're seeing, the blue, the yellow, all that stuff, that's all a separate pass. So imagine cell flopping all of these cells. We had 16 Oxberries working 24 hours a day for a year doing this.
Wow.
No movie will ever be made again. This is so nuts. Okay.
So, I'm curious, they just showed the vector lines on the screen there. That would have to be another, like,
Yep, another layer, all animated. Yep. We had no compositing. Nothing was composited on an optical printer in this movie. It was all self-lab. And see all the flickering and everything? I'll tell you a story about that. We started to have all this flicker, and we couldn't figure out why. And it was driving everybody crazy. And then somebody realized that when you, what a codalith is, right? It's basically a big piece of film. And the way they make it is they take clear acetate and they put it through a bath, and it gets coated, and then it dries, right? Well, every time you go through that bath becomes slightly diluted, right? By 1,000th of a percentage. So that, you can't see that with the naked eye. But if you have a box of 100 codaliths, the one on the bottom is going to be about 2% more dense than the 100th one on the top. And if you shoot them in order, you don't notice it. But if you take codalith number 1 and put it against codalith number 70, it's going to flicker. And it took them weeks to figure out that was the problem. When they did, they just made sure that whenever they got a box of codaliths, they made sure they numbered them 1 through 100. And if you had a scene that was longer than 4 seconds, right, which is more than 96 things, you just had one pop in the scene because you're going to pop to the next box of codaliths. And so we just had this motto on Tron, you know, when in doubt, black it out. And also we just accepted the fact that in the electronic world, things flicker. So that's how it worked. So anyway, you can see Tron had it. It was a beautiful film. Go to the next one. And nothing's like it, you know, it's really something. This scene, by the way, everybody thinks that was a computer scene. It wasn't at all. That's all hand drawing. Go to the next one. So what happened was, you know, we just had an artist we took a shot of the bike, the first frame of the animation, and we made a solid print of that, and then an artist went in and drew a fake polygonal image of the bike, and then it was animated on, and then it was switched to the computer bike, and that's how that was done. It was not a computer, no polygonal model was ever made, you know. So go ahead. So that's how that was done.
It's funny that you drew it as a polygonal model when it wasn't being modeled as polygons. Like that's,
Because even then, people started to have the idea they knew how computers were constructed.
it's kind of
So anyway, Tron Legacy, I don't know if you've seen this, but what's interesting about that is that, go ahead, next frame. Every one frame of Tron Legacy has more computing power than the entire original movie. Next. And then, of course, Tron was on, have you ever seen this one? So, Sue and I have these friends, Rich Moore and Jim Reardon, they were the directors of The Simpsons, and they did that specifically as a joke on us. Was they, you know, he goes in, anybody ever seen the movie Tron? No, 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 no. And then one guy says yes, and then he goes, I mean no. And they were just pimping us. And there's all this weird stuff, you know, you've seen all these things. And you guys ever see this thing with the mask with the tape? Ever see this?
Yeah.
All right, you can go past it then, I guess, yeah. So anyway, we had that every 10 years now we have a Tron thing. There's me and Jerry, and this was at the Grauman's Chinese Theater. Go ahead, and people. It's amazing how many people are into this. Like they dress all these extravagant costumes and everything. Neon, it's just wild.
No, it's because it's awesome.
So yeah, so that's Lisberger today. So now he looks like Grizzly Adams or something. He lives in the south of Santa Monica. He does woodworking all the time. He hardly comes out. And then Bruce Boxleitner is still promoting the movie all the time. You saw him at Disney World with Cindy Morgan doing the slide cycle thing. And then the guy in the middle is Howard Green, is a current Disney publicist. And then on the right is Mike Bonifer, who was the original publicist of Tron. So I think that might be. Oh, and this last shot, I always put this up as kind of like a symbolic thing because can you guys see the device in the back in the shadow? Does anyone know what that is? It's a moviola. And a moviola was the thing we used to view film on. So it's got reels and it's got a little screen. And in the days of film, you would put film on there and you'd run it, and that's how you view everything. And so Jerry and I are sitting looking at the computer screen with the moviola, literally symbolizing the transition to the digital age, where you're never like, nowadays my students have never seen or held a piece of film. There's only 2 labs left in America that would process film. So it's really something that's kind of remarkable that in that short period of time of our lifetimes, this way of making movies is completely changed. So anyway, that's it. Any other questions?
Yeah, we'll take a few minutes now for Q&A with co-curator of Light Cycles exhibition and author of Art of Atari, Tim Lapetino.
Thanks. All right, we'll start with you guys. What questions do you have for me?
So you talked about the role of airbrush sci-fi art in the concept phase of the movie, and that's all that influence is very felt throughout all of it, and the textures you see on screen constantly. How much of that was kind of decided on based on the concept, or versus intersecting with the technology by happenstance?
Almost no intersection at all, like I said. Because the artists, remember, nobody had worked in the computer. There was no Photoshop. There was nothing like that.
Yeah.
All that airbrushing was literally an airbrush with a guy spraying paint. So again, nobody had any skill with it. Nobody really knew what was being done. We just tried to imagine what we thought the world would be like, and then we attempted to find technology to come as close as we could to it. And that's how it was done. It was I called it a symbiotic relationship between the artist and the technologist, because we would go to them and say, look, here's what we really want. They go, oh man, we can't do that. We'd say, well, what can you do? And they'd say, well, we can do this. And so we'd go back and we'd say, hey, we can storyboard that, and we did that through the whole movie. And there was one, I don't know if you remember that sequence where the solar sailor comes out of the hangar, and there's this wall. It's just a simple hangar wall, right? I thought, this is an easy shot. We should have this shot 6 weeks, right? We're waiting and waiting and waiting, and 2 months go by, 10 weeks. Where's the shot? Finally, the shot shows up, and the wall is like a rocky wall. I go, what is that? And they go, that's a fractal wall. They said, that's the very first fractal wall in the history of motion pictures. It took us 2 months to write that code. We go, yeah, but that's not the design, We liked the simple design that Mobius had done, and so we made them take out their fractal wall. Oh, wow. They're really upset.
Probably angry to this day.
Yeah, well, could have been history.
One thing that I was curious about with the life cycle sequence is there's a moment when it's real close up on the bikes, and the bike is kind of going in and out of frame to imply, the speed of the motion and stuff. Was that something that you did in the storyboard stage, or was that something where, you had to input those values? When did that come in as something this is something we're going to do cinematically to make it feel like a chase?
It was difficult to storyboard that precisely because it would take some things we storyboarded so completely, it was almost like watching animation. But some little things like that, you know, we were very fortunate that on the computer end, at the other end, in the computer company, we had a very talented filmmaker named Chris Wedge, who ended up directing Ice Age and all these movies. And he was really a good animator. And so we would talk to him all the time on the phone. And you know, and I remember we would say to him, you know, look, if you can get a little drift in there to make it look natural, go ahead and absolutely do that, you know. So we would ask for it, and Chris would supply it. And I don't know quite now how he would manipulate it, but, you know, the few times when we had those irregularities, that would be just a little extra thing that he would add, you know.
Any other questions?
The Valley Midway arcade game was made here in Chicago, and the Chicago team, George Gomez, came out to California. I'm curious if they met with you while they were out here in terms of collecting kind of intel in terms of creating their games.
You know, they didn't, but I have to say that I do kind of take a lot of credit for the Ring game, because there in the script there was nothing there. It was just like Ram gets killed, or wasn't Ram. This other guy gets killed in this game. They really didn't have any idea what it was, and this is the thing about being a storyboard artist. You know, storyboarding, even though it's hand drawing, it's an incredibly powerful filmmaking power, because you're the first visualizer on the film. And when you draw something, everybody can look and go, ah, that's right. And so throughout the history of movies, storyboard artists, if they're good, have had this almost, you know, unfair, out of this ability to influence a movie. And because you'll draw something and the directors go, that's what I want. And everybody after you, people who build the sets, the people who light the sets, people with the camera, have to follow what you drew. And there are a lot of cases in the history of film where the storyboard artist has had an impact on a movie like that. And that was, in Tron, that was the Ring game, because we had to come up with something, and I just had this idea of these guys standing on rings, you know. And I storyboarded that whole sequence, and we just went right through, they loved it. And then when it got to the final movie, if you notice, they lit the frickin' rings transparent. So you couldn't tell that they were, the whole idea was that they were standing on solid rings, and when you hit it, the ring vanished, and now you had a gap. That was the whole point.
But they were all transparent.
Yeah, when I saw the movie, I went, what have you done? You've ruined the whole idea. Does anybody get this? I was really upset about that. But anyway, made it into the movie, so what are you going to do?
Other question. So you got all these different, you know, computing studios working on different parts of the film. How did you manage to bring that all together and make it look kind of cohesive? Were you worried about everything looking cohesive? Were you just like, okay, we're just segmenting the light cycles from the, you know, from the Solar Sailor? How did you manage that visually and just even story-wise? Or was
Well, I don't think it really does look cohesive. I think it's, the sequences are pretty different, and it was just we were just a victim of we just did what we could do. You know, we did as best we could. We knew what the story was, and we assigned the sequences according to the capabilities of the companies, and we attempted to art direct them in the best possible way. You know.
But there wasn't much art direction, was there? I mean, you're like, you could. This is what you can make. This is what you can make, and.
Well, you know, yeah, but you art directed to the extent you could. You know, you didn't just let them do whatever they wanted. You found out as much what control could you possibly have, and then you, to the degree to which you would have it, you define the color, you define the speed, you define anything else about it. You know. But the other thing that's remarkable, I don't know if you guys know much about visual effects filmmaking, but in modern visual effects films, they'll often do 160 takes of the scene. You know, you're watching Avatar. A lot of those scenes they had 150, 60 versions before he'll sign them off. On Tron, I would say 50% of that movie is the first take. And I can only think of maybe 4 or 5 scenes that we did more than 2 takes. We just couldn't, it was too much work and took too much time, you know? I mean, if there was an egregious mistake, then we'd be able to go back and fix it. But other than that, you know, most of that movie you're watching is like that's it, first take, you know?
And what were the expectations there? Was the expectation like, let's do our best on the first take, or we've got to take what we get? I mean, like, what was the attitude? I'm very curious, like, how did you guys working as creatives interact with the technological limitations?
Well, I have to say that for Jerry, Reese, and I, being Disney animators, trained all our lives, we wanted to be Disney animators. At the time, Disney was the pinnacle of animation. I mean, that was as good as you could get. Your whole mentality was you didn't accept anything but very, very best you could possibly do. That was our whole mindset on every single shot, is this has got to be as absolutely perfect and as great as it can possibly be. So we did what we could, and the only thing we had going for us was because it was so new that we got away with pretty much anything we gave people. Because it looks great, you know. And you know, look, when you're an artist, you're picky and you're never satisfied, you know. But the audience was satisfied. So.
Was Mobius satisfied?
Yeah, I think he was. He liked it. You know, he wasn't. You know, I don't think he was that enthused about it at the end, but he was okay with it. He did some pretty boring films himself, actually. I mean, Sue, my wife Sue back there, she animated in one of his Mobius's films, and it was insane how stupid the film was, and which you've never seen. What was it called? Internal Transfer. Yeah, it was really the worst film. He was a brilliant graphic artist, an incredible comic artist, and everything, but as a filmmaker. I shouldn't say this about movies. So I love movies.
Jumping off that last point about, you know, the consistency and integration of visual effects in, you know, this movie that was essentially live action. You know, your later career, you spent a lot of time in this sort of space of compositing digital into traditional animation and live action. You know, what do you think with Tron? Do you think that there, you know, was there anything in particular that you felt you could directly improve on that in the latest stuff that you did, or was it just as a nature of you know, the visuals getting better, it's easier to integrate them into?
Well, you know, I think that the compositing is just a tool, and it's always what you're compositing that you're most interested in, and how do I get the best possible thing. And the reason that we started our studio and made like Technological Threat and the other movies we made is the computer just couldn't do Disney quality character animation, just couldn't do it. But the computer could do all these other things. So we decided to combine the two, and that was what we did. We made, you know, we'd hand draw stuff and we'd do computer stuff and we'd put it together and we'd have something nobody could do. So that was a lot of fun. And I think the very last, at least in my career, the very last instance of that happening was in like 2001 maybe. I was at Rhythm and Hue Studios, and we were doing the Coca-Cola Polar Bear commercials. Don't you remember those?
Yeah.
And we had just invented a fur program. In those days, again, every computer company had their own proprietary software. So we had come up with fur, which nobody had. And the polar bears used to be cottage cheese with little spikes. And all of a sudden, we have a real fur program, right? So we're going to do this fur program. So they decided to really make it fancy. We're going to have this baby polar bear dive into the water and swim underwater and watch all the fur wave underwater. You know, it was a really great idea. The problem was, you know, we didn't have a really good water program. So there was no way to do a splash. And there were 3 shots in the movie that had splashes. The first was the mom, polar bear, and she's splashing the water like, come on, come on. The polar little baby's over there on another ice floe, and she's going, come on, come on, come on. And finally the baby dives in, right? And he swims over and he jumps out, right? So I thought, well, you know, the client's not going to notice this. All I'm going to do is I'm going to put the camera on the baby. When he dives, just before he hits the water, I'm going to plunge the camera under the water so there's no splash. So you see the baby come into frame and you see bubbles, which we could do. And then the baby's going to swim, and then I'm just going to cut to the mom, and the baby's going to be there. So I've gotten rid of the 2 other splashes. But this splash, we couldn't figure out how to get rid of that. And I just thought, you know, if this was 2D, I've got these great effects animators I know that can animate splashes. And I said, you know what the hell, why don't I just hire one of them? So I hired this Kathy Quaid, this friend of ours, a really good effects animator. And she animated, you know, we filmed the whole thing. And we printed it out in Codaless, right? And we gave her a stack of the images. And she went ahead and she just hand drew a splash. And then we inked and painted it. And we shot it as an element. And then we digitally composited it in. And if you ever see the commercial, you cannot tell it's not CG water, right? So, and I think that was the last time I ever successfully integrated pure hand-drawn animation with pure CG, which you hardly see anymore. You know, nobody really does it, right? So,
That's right.
Thanks, Melissa. This is a totally granular question. I totally apologize for the animation short question, but with the light cycles, I love the fact that they turn like at a perfect right angles, and I can see as an I mean I'm so logical myself. I'm like, they have to like bend and turn and do this and that, but like in the sequence they're instantaneous, and knowing now that you couldn't really see it in advance, I'm wondering, was that just like an idea you guys had that like had to happen? Obviously aesthetically it works, but it seems like a huge chance to take, like to figure out mathematically how they're going to turn and it's going to look like that.
Well, of course, it was actually the absolute easiest thing to do. Because it's a hell of a lot easier to just go this to this than just to figure all the angles and all the tilts and all the curves. Matter of fact, I think
is that what they do? I haven't frame by framed it. Is that what they?
Well, no, I think I explained. We had to graph out a curve, then you had to hash out all the curves, and you had to figure out all the angles, and so that was a lot of work. And I think it was because the light cycles were the very first thing we did that we thought it was just too much work to do curves. So we said, what if we just make them turn, you know? And the other thing about it was it felt computery.
Yeah.
You know, it just felt like that would be in the world. And so we did that. And because again, it's hard to believe that was the very first thing we did in the whole movie, was the light cycles, you know? I mean, if you look at some of the later sequences, like the recognizers and stuff, there's some pretty sophisticated stuff in those. We were getting better as we went.
Were the bits also CG?
You mean the bit, like the interview? Oh yeah, that's pure CG.
Okay.
It's all magic. Yeah.
Okay.
And the grid bug, I think you mentioned the grid bug earlier. That was hand animated, pure hand animated by this one animator, John Norton, and he was one of Steve's old animators, and he just did it. And it has nothing to do with the movie, nothing at all. It's never mentioned anywhere else. And there's a voiceover explaining to you, oh, we better watch out for those grid bugs. That you never see them anywhere. You know where they are.
Was that in the script? Why was that even? Why was
No,
that?
because John Norton had animated these grid bugs, and Steve felt sorry for him because he worked so hard animating these stupid grid bugs. So they put one shot in the movie, and it completely makes no sense. And did you guys notice when the Solar Sailor goes over the Sea of Simulation, Mickey Mouse's head is in there? Did you notice that? Everybody sees that, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a scene when Sark is looking at the big map, the Pac-Man.
Yeah.
Sort of a few those little gags in the movie, you know. So.
Another question right there.
How common was the idea of the grid at the time? Or was that something that was hard to sell or hard for the team to get a mind on?
How hard it was what?
The idea of the grid, or everything being in this modular grid, was that something that was easy to...
That seemed very computery, you know. I mean, the grid was a real metaphor for, you know, the base of the world. You know, it's supposed to be, and that was also, I think, kind of slang at that time, you know, going onto the grid. You know, it was like going onto the playing field. And so the grid seemed like a natural visual to match the mentality of the gaming world. You know.
Did you guys run into more issues?
Well, you can see them all over the place.
I did, actually.
Oh, you didn't really notice it? Well,
No.
again, if you're really, you know, it's a very primitive looking film in a lot of ways, but it's, you know, again, it has charm, and we were talking about this earlier, you know. If your primary goal is entertainment and storytelling, and you achieve that, most of the audience doesn't care about technical problems, you know. I always think of this movie that was made years ago called Spy Kids.
Robert Rodriguez?
Yeah, like the worst effects ever
He made it in
made.
his garage.
What?
He made it in his garage.
Yeah, the absolute worst effects, and it made a fortune, because who cares, you know? I'll tell you this one story. Have you guys ever heard of SIGGRAPH? SIGGRAPH is the abbreviation. But in the old days, they had the electronic theater, which was the big show. And before the show, sometimes they would actually have interactive games. The whole audience would play. So they would give you like paddles with black and white, and you could, and the left side of the theater would play against the right side of the theater, and you'd flip, and you'd operate a pawn, you know, stuff like that. Well, one year, and this is back in like '86. Some guy had written the very first, I think, example of procedural animation. He had just invented a little caterpillar made of blocks. There's just 8 blocks. That's all it was. They weren't even connected. But it behaved like a caterpillar, right? So it crawled, and if it came to an obstacle, it would crawl over the obstacle or go around the obstacle. And he had written like an artificial intelligence program defining all, because it didn't have many behaviors, right? Its behavior was go forward, and when you come to something, either go around it or go over it, and that was his behavior. So he throws this up, and no one knows what it's going to do because you don't know what obstacles it's going to encounter. So it's going along, and the audience is watching this, and it comes to the first thing that goes over, and everybody's, it goes around that way. And then it gets to the steps, and there's these 3 steps, right? And each step is a little higher than the first one. So it goes up the first step, and everybody's okay, and then it just makes it up the second step, right? It gets to the 3rd step, and this little caterpillar is like fighting and fighting and fighting, and the crowd is like, come on, come on, come on, come on. And then it makes it up, and the place went nuts. I mean, you would have thought the World Series, right, the Super Bowl, I mean, the SIGGRAPH audience went freaking nuts. And then the next movie was like an ILM's latest movie that cost $2 million and had all this incredible stuff, and people practically fell asleep there all And that was the great lesson in, you got to capture the audience, right? You got to get the audience believing in the characters and caring about the characters. They don't care at all about the technology. So that's the great lesson.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop.
Yeah, I think so.
Awesome.
Hey, thanks for coming, you guys.